What's up, you guys? It's indie scientist Kidnyo here, and today I'm watching a video called "We All Travel Faster Than the Speed of Light." I wish we all travel at the speed of light from Float Head Physics. Um, yeah, I'm just a guy who comes up with science ideas. So let's see what I think about this one.
To space-time at the speed of light. But the problem in most resources that I found was that first of all, it just told me that, but I don't like it. I want to discover things myself. I like to piece things together and then come up with a conclusion myself. I think that's one of the richest way to learn science. But more importantly, I did not see a broader significance of that until a few weeks ago. I finally started reading this book called Relativity Visualized by Louis Epstein, and thank you because a few of you actually recommended that for me, and I think that has started to blow my mind away because for one, it does exactly that. It helped me discover by piecing things together as to why we say that things are traveling through space-time at the speed of light and what does it really mean. But more importantly, it showed me some true incredible explanatory power it had. I mean, I was able to see time dilation, length contraction, relativity of simultaneity, even Twins paradox, all of it, just like in a very brand new perspective. And
It's exciting.
that's not all. It was also able to help me ponder upon some of the most deepest questions of physics, like why do we have three dimensions of space and just one dimension of time? Or why is it that I can move freely back and forth through space, but I am always a prisoner of the current, present, now when it comes to time? So I am now super excited to share this with you. And if you are as well, let's get started. So, Louise, where do we start?
I think that the reason why we view time as separate and also linear is just because we don't really know what we're talking about, right? We don't do the same thing with space. I think where we allow ourselves to be inaccurate a little bit more easily. But let's see what he says.
Lewis says, let's take a concrete analogy. We have an aeroplane, and let's imagine in this world, the aeroplane will always move at a constant speed of 1 meter per second. Okay? So in the first 1 second, let's say the aeroplane moves straight up. So that's 1 meter. Then in the next 1 second, let's say the aeroplane moves that way, another 1 meter. And in the last 1 second, let's say the aeroplane moves horizontally to the right. Okay? But now, what if we were to look at the same thing one more time, but by putting some lights and we were to focus on the shadow that the aeroplane formed? What would be the speed of that shadow in each of these seconds? Well, let's see. So in the first 1 second, that shadow is at rest. In the next 1 second, it starts moving, so it speeds up a little bit. So it starts moving with some speed. And then in the last 1 second, it speeds up even more. It moves even faster. Now, here's the big question. Imagine there was a couple of shadow people. You can imagine them to be two-dimensional beings who thought that their world was two-dimensional. That's it. They couldn't comprehend the third dimension. So for all they know, that shadow is an actual object. So what would they be seeing and how would they be perceiving things? Well, let's see. From their perspective, they would say in that first 1 second, that shadow was at rest. It didn't move at all. That object is not moving. In the next 1 second, that object say, hey, it started moving a little bit. And then they say, oh, it's moving even faster. So they see that object accelerating. Now, you and I know what's really going.
The funny thing I always think about those kinds of experiments, not to really say anything about this, is just the idea that two dimensions would be perceived two-dimensionally to a two-dimensional individual. I think um, it's just interesting because it's just like, okay, well, what if there's only two dimensions, which I actually think there's infinite dimensions, but if there's only two, what would the world really look like, right? Because you don't have time. So, and I think this is why they often separate time as a dimension for um, from other dimensions, just because we don't really know how to think about what we're talking about when we say time, which I think part of that comes from the fact that usually when we say time, we're talking about all of the dimensions 4 through infinity, right? Everything that we consider to not be stable or like, an object or something like that, we consider that to be, moving in the dimension of time, right? But I don't know. I don't know if that could possibly be true, except for the simplest of three-dimensional things like a proton. But let's continue.
Going on. We understand that really that object is traveling at the same speed in 3 dimensions. But since that shadow only represents a 2-dimensional projection, that's why that shadow will have variable speed. But they don't know that. In fact, if they could see that shadow long enough and the plane kept on moving and twisting and turning, but all the while maintaining that constant speed of 1 meter per second, they will eventually realize that shadow keeps moving, but it will have a maximum speed of 1 meter per second. And they would be wondering why that would be the case. In fact, they would realize that in this world, everything has a speed limit. Their universe has a speed limit of 1 meter per second. Nobody can break through it. They'll postulate it, but they'll have absolutely no idea why that's happening. So do you see what Lewis is foreshadowing over here? Just like those 2-dimensional shadow people, we think that there is a speed limit in our universe, the speed of light, and nothing can go faster than light. But maybe that's because we are seeing a 3-dimensional shadow of what's really happening in 4-dimensional space-time. Maybe everything in the space-time is moving just like that aeroplane at a constant speed, always at the speed of light. But because we are seeing a projection of it in our universe, we perceive it as a speed limit. But maybe it's not the case. Maybe everything is moving at the speed of light. So we can now begin to see where this idea stems from, right? But we are far away from accepting this idea as of now, because remember, this is science. Unlike in religion, we don't just accept ideas. In fact, one of the best ways to deeply understand science is to be a skeptic and always try to figure out what if, like try to counter it, try to refute it from different angles. So that's what we'll do. So we should at this point look at Lewis and say, Lewis, cool story, bro. But how can we validate this? I mean, is there a way that these shadow people can actually somehow validate that from their perspective, that indeed that there's a bigger world out there and objects may be traveling at a constant speed? Because if these shadow people cannot validate it, then we have no idea of validate. I mean, we will not be able to validate it, right? And then it'll just remain a story with no reason to have any confidence in it, right? And so this is where Lewis says, maybe they can. I'm like, how? How could these shadow people ever hope to understand that there could be a bigger world out there? Like, how would they do that? Well, the key over here is to imagine a second shadow on a wall perpendicular to this first shadow. Now, I know what you're thinking at this point. I'm also having the same thought. Luis, what's the point of having to look at this shadow? Because these folks are stuck in their 2 dimensions, right? They will not be able to perceive the shadow or look at that shadow. So what's the point in looking at that? And Louis says, well, you're right. But remember, just like us, we are stuck in our 3 dimensions and we cannot see time, but we can still measure the flow of time with our clocks, right?
I just thought that was really interesting that we say that we can't see time. Like he referenced, we can see clocks. You can see stuff move. If there was no time, things wouldn't move. So I think we can see time pretty well. We can also see gravity. I can look and see that a chair is not flying off into space because it's on the ground. It's got that gravity. So it seems pretty visible, but
similarly, what if they cannot see the shadow, but somehow they can measure how quickly that shadow is moving? They can measure the speed of that shadow somehow, okay? Then would they be able to, use the speed of this shadow and then use the speed of this shadow, which they can easily see, and then piece it all together and see there's something deeper going on over here? Well, let's find out. Let's find out if we can do that. So now let's relook at this whole thing in its whole glory now by looking at a couple of shadows, and let's keep track of both the shadows, speed of both the
also, it's like the funny thing about, because my hypothesis is that, time really moves on the scale of an atom. And the funny thing about our clocks, it's like they're not really necessarily measuring time itself, right? Because let's say you had a clock that was in time dilation, it's going to move faster or slower. Does that mean time moves faster or slower? No, it just means that they have different relative positions. And so they're experiencing different types of things. But what is the clock actually measuring, right? The clock is measuring, depending how it's invented, some sort of, cyclical change, whether that's like, I don't know, the vibration of a crystal or something with energy pumped into it or something like that. But something regular that it can use to keep time even if it's digital. Um, but um, it's I think more of just a blessing of our reality that um, our macro three-dimensional objects like the sun and the earth and the moon uh, also have cyclical patterns that are relevant to us. Um, and then generally, of course, we can use the space is between intervals since we all share the same relative location. We can use that to time up, okay, after this many whatever, but it's a physical thing, right? So, a clock is really the same thing as a map, right? It's just that you're measuring small physical distances to tell you when or where to meet up. It's okay after, just like if you told someone walk 3 steps forward, 5 to the right, now you're saying okay, but also walk or wait. I guess you don't have to walk, but wait. 1,700 atomic um, cycles as well, which is a distance. But anyway, let's continue.
The shadows. All right. So in the first 1 second, okay, we zoom in. In the first 1 second, this shadow is at rest, but look, this shadow moves completely 1 meter. It is moving at the maximum speed. So this is at rest, but this shadow, the vertical shadow, is moving at a maximum speed. In the next 1 second, this shadow starts moving, its speed increases, but its speed decreases. I mean, this distance is now a little smaller than 1 meter. So you see, this speed increases, this speed decreases, and in the last 1 second, look, the horizontal speed is maximum, but the vertical speed has become 0. And so by looking at this, they will be seeing that there is some connection between the vertical speed and the horizontal speed. When the horizontal speed increases, the vertical speed decreases. When the horizontal speed decreases, the vertical speed increases. There is some connection between them. And what is that connection? Well, the connection is if this arrow represents the horizontal speed and this arrow represents the vertical speed, we can now see that they form a right angle triangle with the total three-dimensional speed. Which means if we label them, let's call H for horizontal, V for vertical, and we know this speed is always 1 because that speed is always constant. That's constant, 1 meter per second. Then just by using Pythagoras, we know that the squares of these speeds should add up to give us 1. This means if the shadow people start measuring things carefully, and then eventually maybe by trial or error, once they figure out the connection between the horizontal shadow speed and the vertical shadow speed, and if they can figure this out, then they will get it. Then they will realize, hey, why is this happening? And from that, they would be able to use their own analogy in their two-dimensional space to sort of think about it, probably in an abstract terms, that there is a third dimension out there, and this plane and all the objects in the third dimension must be traveling at a constant speed, and we are seeing only a two-dimensional projection of it and all of that. And by using Pythagoras, that's it. By using Pythagoras, they can piece things together and say that maybe there's a third dimension out there. There's a higher dimension out there, and this object, which again they cannot perceive properly, must be traveling at the same speed, and we are seeing a two-dimensional.
I think this is really a better explanation as far as like a more intuitive explanation. It seems like if you have like maybe a lot of math and science in your head, this starts you down the path of intuitively thinking about these things without really connecting some of the dots. But let's see where he goes next.
Projections. Isn't that insane? That is insane if you ask me. But of course, what's even more important for us is, look, we are slowly and steadily piecing things together, isn't it? Just like how I pieced together my website, floatedphysics.com, using Squarespace, the sponsor of this video. So how do we piece together a website? Well, just like physics, you use some fundamental tools, and Squarespace provides one of the most powerful ones. For example, you can use custom templates. So let's go ahead and build a one-pager for ourselves. We pick something that we like, and boom, the aeroplane appeared to be at rest in their dimension. It did so because all of its speed was vertical, which they can't see, of course. However, later on, that aeroplane just turned. It didn't change its speed. Its speed is still the same, but because it turned, now some of its velocity got directed in our horizontal direction, and that's why we saw it moving. And of course, the vertical speed decreased. And later on, it turned almost completely, so we have the maximum speed in our horizontal, in our space, and the vertical speed almost became a zero. So we now have a way to validate this, which means we can now apply it to our own.
I will say this, though. I am currently working in my hypothesis on a reason for why certain dimensions, like the third and fourth dimension, are coupled via the traditional axis, 90-degree angles, and why the other dimensions, second and third dimension, may be coupled via 45-degree angles. Working on something.
Universe. So in our universe, the horizontal over here, our world represents 3D space, and the vertical dimension over here would represent the time. And so if this is true, that everything is moving through space-time at the speed of light, the maximum speed that we perceive, the speed of light, then we should have a very similar equation. They should also obey a very similar equation. The speed through space squared plus the speed through time squared should equal 1. 1 being the speed of light in our case. In this video, the speed of light is 1. Okay, so we now have a way to validate if this makes sense. And so the big next question is this true? Let's find out again. So for this, we go back to our photon clock. Remember, just to recap, the photon clock is where a photon ping pongs between a couple of mirrors. Every time it hits one of the mirrors, we get a tick. Okay, so from this, we realize that because speed of light is a constant, what we find is that moving things will have photon clocks that are ticking slower. The faster they move, look, the slower it ticks. But now let's try to see if that relationship holds between them. Okay, so for that, let's look at this one more time. Here we go. And if I concentrate on the speed of this photon is traveling this way, of course, with the speed of light 1. But the horizontal component of that photon represents the horizontal speed of this cart. And the vertical speed of that photon represents the speed of time, like how fast the time is passing in this cart. So if we accept this is the speed through space, and that this truly represents the speed through time, then look, we are indeed getting the same equation. Pythagoras makes a comeback. Pythagoras is incredible because he transcends dimensions of space and time. So this is incredible. So now we can also use the same story, and we can say, hey, look, here the cart is at rest in spatial dimension, but all of that speed, the cart is moving at the speed of light through the time dimension at full speed. Therefore, its clock is ticking at the maximum rate. However, later on, some of that speed is diverted to space. Therefore, we see that cart moving through space, but now the speed through time decreases, and therefore this clock ticks slower. And the same effect happens over here, and everything now starts making sense. This is incredible, isn't it? So this idea beautifully and elegantly explains why as you move faster through space, you move slower through time dilation. But folks, we're not done, because this is the climax. This is where Lewis truly starts blowing my mind away, because now we will see its true explanatory power at explaining other consequences. Are you ready for this? Okay, let's look at it. All right. So again, let's go back to that plane, but this time in full 4 dimensions. Okay, let's say that plane is at rest in space, and this is our space right now, and I'm only showing 2 dimensions of space because I want to show I want to use the rest of the other dimension to represent time. And when I say time, I
just really just love to do whatever they want. They're like, well, space is flat, but I get it. But I think again, I think that what I was telling you about my hypothesis of the relationship between dimensions might explain really what he's talking about. As for why, though, like he's explaining the what.
I mean proper time, the time on the clock. You can imagine a clock inside the airplane.
I really shouldn't even say that, because I haven't even really written it up. So just right now, it's all metaphysics.
That's the time that I'm talking about, not the time that we would be looking in our clock, because the flow of that time will always be the same. That'll never get dilated. That'll never change. I'm talking about this clock, the time on the clock on the airplane. Okay, that makes sense, right? That's the proper time. All right, okay. Anyways, now, if this airplane is at rest in space, that means it's moving at full speed through time, and therefore that means it is moving in this particular diagram vertically upwards. In other words, this velocity, which is not three-dimensional velocity, it's a velocity in 4 dimensions, is directed perpendicular to the spatial dimensions. And I know it's hard to comprehend that, because how do you imagine perpendicular to three-dimensional space?
I don't think. But one thing I was thinking about as well is, dimensions as really phase transitions through energy. And this would make the same sense too, because really, what he's talking about is not ordinary movement so much as movement as a progression towards the speed of light, right? So it's like if you're moving half the speed of light, which is very fast. These are very, 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 very fast movements. And in our sort of reality, none of that really even happens, except as a consequence of gravity. That's the first time you start seeing it. Like, really, no matter how fast we move, we're not going to see too much time dilation. But if you get further away, I mean, maybe if you're moving really fast. But anyway, if you're going to get further away from gravity, why? Because gravity is, acceleration. So gravity causes time dilation. Doing my best to explain stuff that I barely understand. But yes, so it would make sense that as you put more energy into something, you are literally transitioning it from three-dimensional to being four-dimensional, or at least into leaving 3 dimensions. Just kind of interesting. I almost feel like might be better to say entering into 3 dimensions, because it's like, well, distance is, first of all, an imaginary sort of concept, but also it's as a result, in my hypothesis, of really the second dimension. And so we are able to perceive light, as like communication. And I think that's a very special trait, because we're looking at things not necessarily how they are, but definitely how they were, but how they lay out. I don't really even know how to explain it. It's almost like X-rays, because we're like looking through a lot of things. But it's also, anyway, so it's almost like the speed of light itself is what we would truly consider three-dimensional existence. Whereas what we currently perceive is a second dimensional slice of the two-dimensional, right? Because we're flat facing one direction, right? And we see in 2 dimensions, we see an image, a flat image of the world. It's just that, there's a lot of them. Anyway, I don't want to rant the whole video.
We can't comprehend that, but just like how these space folks couldn't comprehend that shouldn't stop us from trying to understand the implications of this, right? Okay. So what do we see? Well, we see only a shadow of it, and because it's moving completely through time, we do not see it moving, but it is moving through time at full speed. Now comes the question, what happens as this shadow starts moving? If the shadow has to move, the plane has to turn. This velocity has to turn. Only then the shadow will start moving. Only then it'll be able to give it some speed in the spatial direction, right? But now look, if that arrow turns, look at how that plane turns. The plane turns like this. It has to turn like this because from its own perspective, the time axis should always be perpendicular to itself. From its own perspective, remember, it's not moving. So from its own perspective, it should be in the spatial dimension. The time axis should always be perpendicular to it. It should be flowing only through time from its own perspective. Therefore, that's what it looks like. And therefore, when we now look at its projection on space, look, it looks contracted. And that makes sense, right? Because the whole thing has turned like this. And so its projection becomes smaller. That's length contraction, folks. This explains a lot of things. For example, what happens if it's moving faster through space? If it has to move faster through space, it has to turn even more. And now that shadow...
I get what he's saying, though I don't find it as exciting. It seems more of just like a good mathematical resolution for what he's talking about, which is cool.
Shadow will become even more contracted. Length contraction depends on the speed. More the length contraction. But you can also see length contraction only happens in the direction of the spatial motion. In the perpendicular direction, there is no length contraction, and you can see why, because it doesn't turn like that. It only turns in the direction of the spatial motion. That's why we only see length contraction this way. Isn't that beautiful, folks? Okay, but we're not done. We're not done.
He's excited.
All right, if we go back over here, when it was at rest with respect to space, we see that the whole aeroplane maps to one specific point in time over here on our diagram. And therefore, all the clocks that are attached to that particular aeroplane will read the same time. The clock on the front and the clock on the back, they will all be synchronized. They can all be synchronized and they will read the same time. But now, what happens when that plane starts moving through our spatial dimension? What happens when it turns in the four-dimensional space-time? Well, let's look at it. Here we go. If you look at it, this time you see that the front of that plane is slightly lower in time axis compared to the back of the plane. The back of the plane is elevated in the time axis. In other words, the back of the plane, the front of the plane will be behind in time compared to the back of the plane. Can you see that? This explains relativity of simultaneity. From the plane's perspective, these two clocks are in sync, like we saw in the previous slide. But from our perspective, the two clocks are no longer in sync. The clock behind is actually ahead in time, and it makes perfect sense. And if you add again what we saw earlier, because it's now moving, it's diverted some of its velocity through space, the velocity through time has decreased, therefore it is also time dilated. The time is also dilated now. We see all three consequences: the time dilation, the length contraction, and the relativity of simultaneity, the clock desynchronization, all in one picture. I promised you that, and that's what we got. Just look at it. Isn't that beautiful? Oh my god, it's just insane. Oh man.
Relax, buddy.
But we are not done. There's more I want to show you.
I'm just joking. This should be fun. Let's see.
This time we have two twins who are at rest with respect to each other, and therefore they're moving full speed through time. But let's say the twin sister, this one is the sister, let's say, she decides to venture off into space. To do that, she will have to turn her velocity vector, because remember, this is the velocity in four-dimensional space-time. That will always be 1, the speed of light. That cannot change. The only thing she can do is turn. When she turns, some of her speed gets diverted into space, and so she can now start moving away from her twin brother. But in doing so, she is now moving slower through time. And because her brother is moving full speed through time, you can immediately see when she returns, she will not be able to catch up to him in time. When she returns, she would be behind him. Doesn't this make perfect sense now? The reason she will be behind him is because she diverted some of her speed to space. The moment she did that, she started lagging behind, and there is no way she can catch up because the total speed is the same. He's using his total speed to go only through time.
As a thought experiment, because I've been making these well, you probably don't know, but I've been making these rings that I call time machine rings. One way they work is by reducing energy. It's a concept that organization is lower entropy, and so it should work in this context the way he's explaining it. Just using it as a thought experiment. Only available on my Patreon, by the way. That's Patron. Link in my bio, kenyo.org. You can find my Patreon. But back to this. Hypothetically, what these rings should do is boost the speed of, let's say, the red arrow without, so you would be ahead without someone having had to do the green arrow thing. How is that? So we're adding space, right? We're actually reducing the amount of space that's being taken up and encoding it into a previously already existent lower entropy. I'm going to have to work on this more, but this just did give me a great idea in that area and kind of some proof as to how these time machine rings really do boost your progress through time, which is the main point. But it doesn't fully address, at least in this diagram, the way I think my rings do, which is the, well, how do you know where you're going to get? How do you know where you're going to get? Because time, unlike space, time is space. Like, even if you look at this diagram, right? What is each unit of time made up of? Right? It's made up of a new layer of space. So while you're traveling through time, you're just going through whole sets of the universe faster. And the result becomes the same. Now you're looking for an address, which I believe an address literally is a temporal spatial construct. And the question is, where are you trying to go? Where are you trying to go? And usually, if you're traveling through time, the question is either the past or the future. But the question also is, what is that really? And what's there?
Time. So of course she will lag behind him in time, and therefore she's the one that's younger than him when they meet up. Look at that. Amazing, isn't it? This now brings us to the last question. Why do we have 3 dimensions of space when we can move through it, but we have only 1 dimension of time and we are locked in it? Lewis, let's take it home. So Lewis says, imagine when the universe was born, we had...
Basically, what he was explaining, though, right there is if one person launched off into a rocket, went super duper 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 fast, when they come back down to Earth, they're gonna have aged slower due to time dilation. Same thing with, like, if you go somewhere where there's a bunch of gravity. Gravity is accelerating you, whether or not you would realize it, though. That's the only thing that sci-fi doesn't really get right, because you wouldn't survive. But I mean, certain increases in gravity, sure, but very quickly it becomes untenable. But anyway, so the idea is the faster that you are, the more energy that you're putting into moving through space, you're really decelerating. That energy is coming from your move through time, which I'm actually going to have to think about a little more, because honestly, it doesn't really actually make any sense to me. Except for if we're viewing time purely as entropy, and what you're losing. No, still doesn't make sense. Actually, that would be the other way around. So I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about that.
All 4 spatial dimensions, all 4 dimensions of space-time were identical. Then we put a particle in it, and that particle always has to travel at the same speed. In 4-dimensional space-time, remember, everything is traveling at the speed of light in some direction. Now, the direction in which it is traveling at the speed of light, that particular direction will be length contracted to completely 0. Because remember, length contraction becomes 0 if you're traveling at the speed of light, right? Therefore, in that particular dimension, you will not have any access. You will only see a ghost of it, but you only have access to all the dimensions perpendicular to it, and you can freely move in those dimensions only. That's what ends up becoming our spatial dimensions, and the ghost of that dimension that is left over is what becomes our time dimension. This is why, from our own perspective, we'll find that whichever direction we are traveling through space-time at the speed of light, that dimension is length contracted and ends up becoming our time dimension. That's why we are moving, from our own perspective, we're always moving through time at the maximum speed. Our clocks are always running at the maximum speed, 1 second per second. But in the perpendicular direction, there is no length contraction, and so I have full access to it to move around. That ends up now becoming my spatial dimension. I will be honest with you, I still haven't fully wrapped my head around this, and I'm sure there is more to it, but that's such a profound way of thinking about some of these incredibly deep things in physics.
Yes, it really is. It really is. And I think for scientists, the imagination component really does become the big challenge, because a lot of science is really learning how to do things that you don't understand. And then, later on, you start the understanding, right? And so you're like, okay, now that I know how to do all of these equations and I've memorized all of these different types of things, what can be done with them, right? So you have to earn your your ability to be a math science PhD, unless you're an indie scientist like me and you can just start making stuff up without having all the knowledge. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Go ahead and like and subscribe. You being here is amazing. You subscribing will mean that you're here more times. Yes, it'll mean that you move less around other channels. But guess what? You'll be moving more times in this direction. That kind of explains a little bit of what he was saying as well, too. Anyway, see you guys later.